good morning. I'm Monta Welch. I'm the Director of People's Visioning, and I want to thank all of you for tuning in to our People's Visioning program this morning. We've started this new programming for a little over a month now. We've been talking to you about all the concerns with farming and our two different models, sustainable versus unsustainable model of food over these last several programs, and about some of our legislation, which is of course an issue ongoing all the way now until our November elections. I will mention that there are some vetoes in the veto session that are concerning some of the issues related to the Right to Farm Act, or the amendment rather, that is currently undergoing a recount. So we will update you on that when we know, maybe towards the end of this week or very soon, on the outcome of that, to see whether the narrow margin changes in one direction or the other. So we will continue to update you on these issues of farming and sustainability, as we also look at other important matters, because with People's Visioning, we look at a whole range of topics in a true People's Vision. Certainly the food and water security issues of energy, of finance, but also issues that are regarding our public health and jobs and building better communities, and as well justice issues. Social, cultural, economic, environmental justice issues, which include the issues that now we're again in national headlines, as we were with the Right to Farm Amendment. But this time we're going to be talking a little more today about the other issue we've been in national headlines with, the racial discrimination issues, the unrest that relate to our civil liberties, and that do definitely seem to be racially impacted. The issues in Ferguson, Missouri, the shooting, unfortunately, of any human being without a due process of Michael Brown. So we will catch up on those things during the course of our conversation here today, and keep you up to date on that as well. But we're beginning more a discussion of that issue today. We did have as our last guest a new young candidate who will be running against Vicky Hartzler in the District 4 here in this part of the state, although we do have candidates in all of the viewing areas that we urge you to study your candidates and learn where they are on all these issues. And we did touch base on the issues in Ferguson in that conversation as well. And today we're going to go further into that with our guest, whom I will introduce. Wayne Brekes is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Missouri. He earned his bachelor's degree at the North Dakota State University and his master's and his doctorate from Rutgers. He's been a resident of Columbia and a faculty member here at the university since 1999. And he's won some outstanding awards in teaching, including the university's prestigious Kemper Teaching Fellowship. He's also won awards both at the university, statewide and national levels in undergraduate advising. And I can attest that Wayne is really great with his students, because People's Visioning has had student interns, and he was the sociology professor overseeing those internships. He teaches a variety of courses related to these interests, and sociology introductory courses as well. He's also the president of one of our co-sponsors in People's Visioning, Democracy for Missouri, which is a grassroots political organization affiliated with Democracy for America, the more national organization founded by Howard Dean. And this organization focuses on progressive social change at local and state levels. And so I'd like to welcome Wayne as our guest today. Hi, Wayne.
Thank you, Monta. Hello.
Yeah. So we're really, really lucky to have you as part of People's Visioning, and Democracy for Missouri also as part of People's Visioning. And today we'd like to call on your expertise in the area of sociology to help us have this conversation at more in-depth levels regarding a focus on both this issue of race, but also the militarization of our police and some history as well that we might like to look at and unpack as we talk about this issue that's going on in Ferguson and in our national communities. So I'd like to ask you if you would give us what your perspective might be from looking at these issues in Ferguson from your educated position as a sociologist, and just kind of let you open with some of your thoughts on this issue as we go forward, and then we'll bring in some other pieces.
Okay. I think one issue to look at, particularly with respect to Ferguson, is that we can look at police excessive use of force and police community conflicts both as a national issue. I mean, certainly people are familiar with this is not the only community that has had conflicts. I mean, I even think back to my own experience, my first kind of experience with police conflict in 1991. I lived in New Jersey. I'd moved there from North Dakota, and I lived at the border of a low-income minority neighborhood, and when I lived there, a police officer by the name of Zane Grey shot an unarmed African-American man, Sean Potts, in the back, killing him. And the official police story didn't come out till 24 hours later, which coincidentally is how long it took the Ferguson story to come out, the official one. But the police story was that Officer Gray had tripped on a faulty stairwell, and that the gun accidentally discharged, shooting the man squarely, and killing him with one shot. So that was different in the sense that there were fewer shots. But in that case, what was also interesting is that the police repaired the stairwell that night, so there was no evidence to look at. And after that, the next day, members of the community marched to the courthouse, yelling "No justice, no peace." Had a peaceful rally at the courthouse and there was tremendous police presence around that march, much like Ferguson. Yeah, very similar.
Just less militarized.
And then I mean, it was militarized for a 1991 police force. I mean, there were definitely like SWAT, but it was
pretty significant for the time.
Didn't have the kind of shock and awe, spectacular I mean, they weren't using quite warlike things. And then that night there was a kind of small disturbance where, in fact, some shop windows were broken and there was vandalism and throwing of bottles and things like that. A civil disturbance, a sort of mini riot. And then and that had happened right below where I live. I mean, the shooting had happened a few blocks from where I live, but this disturbance happened right below where I lived. And then for the next 3 days or so, police from around the state did paramilitary war maneuvers right below where I lived. And in fact, I couldn't sleep because there was, like, the canine dogs would go around, like they'd have a route where they'd go around the block. And so every 2 minutes it would be arf, 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 and going around and just like, so.
You were in the middle of a war zone for that time.
Yeah,
compared to now.
So in one sense, I was thinking, well, it seems like we've seen this before, and people living in other communities will have seen things like it before. So in some ways, there's nothing new here. But I also think that that local police cultures matter a lot. That it's not just across the board. Police community relations are the same, because they're not. So local cultures matter, and this city I lived in had some other problem. I mean, this was not its only case of police brutality and excessive force. I mean, it had a local culture with a lot of corruption.
Had their own issues.
Problems, yes. And I think what you see in St. Louis County are some unique structural issues which make it different than other places, which make it easier for bad police officers to maintain their jobs.
I'd like to talk about that structure in a minute, but first, before we go to that structure, because I would like to get back to that, I'd like to mention, if you could, and both of us could comment too, about a recent Washington Post article that lays out some of the economic issues and even touches on that as well. And folks can, learn more about this if you, want to Google, some of these things and use the internet to research articles you might not have otherwise access to. But, how the structure in a lot of communities is related to the economics. And maybe this would be a good time before we go into that now, because we're kind of talking in our conversation so far about present day and history, like, some decades ago when you had an experience that was very similar to this. I think for those of us who do pay attention to history, Zane Grey is kind of a name that is notable in history. And so this, time that you're speaking about is something that once reminded, gets easily brought back to the surface of memory for that. And I would like to point out, because I know a lot of the viewers here do live in areas that get supplied by the electric co-ops, and the electric co-ops have a newsletter that goes out. And in your rural electric cooperative, you may have read a recent, I believe it was their very last issue, a recent article about history and our own state's Civil War history. So going back even that far within the terms of this issue we're talking about, racism, with the issue of economics, what does that have to do with it? And I think that if we go back to the Civil War era, that we realize that we have some strong roots on both sides of that issue here in the state of Missouri. Our state was the last state in the Union now to give up its model of slavery, and that has a very strong economic dynamic to the reasons, that folks were very resistant to giving up slavery. And so today we have some sort of a different form of that in some areas, some models, like you were saying, the local models with both the police culture, but maybe even how the economics layer onto that. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, there was a really interesting and very long, I thought, fascinating for in this age of soundbite journalism, a long article in the Washington Post. I'm forgetting the exact title, but it was talking about how St. Louis County municipalities generate revenue from the poor, from poverty, and that a lot of what this article talked about is St. Louis County has 90 different municipalities, and some of them are tiny with, well, I think one of them has like 15 people, but more often they're tiny in terms of
a few hundred or something.
A few hundred, 2,200.
Yeah, a couple thousand.
And most of these municipalities have their own police forces, their own courts, their own judges, and where the tax base is low and there's not a lot of revenue raised through other taxes, the primary ways that they raise revenue are through fines for petty offenses, driving without a tail light, not having proof of insurance on you at the time you're pulled over, and what they will do is rather aggressively police these areas, pull people over all the time to create revenue, and then add on a bunch of fines if you fail to appear in court, make a late payment, things like that. And so, and it's possible in a 5-mile drive that you could get pulled over by police officers in 6 different municipalities, because the
They're
municipalities
very close and they're small.
are tiny, and they're policed, and they're generally also not policed by members who live
in that community.
that particular municipality. Like the folks who police it can come from all over St. Louis County.
So it's not like the guy down the street kind of knows you're, someone who's not going to be like, creating some real rowdiness and problems, but maybe you had a Chicago roll through the stop sign or something,
Yeah, it's not a community policing situation. It's more of a police generating revenue situation, and generating revenue often in municipalities that are largely poor, largely minority, but not even necessarily. I mean, it's mostly poor minorities, but poor white people as well.
Right. Yeah, just the poor in general, but obviously a large mix of multi-ethnic
Right.
folks, including poor white folks as well.
And also what you have in this structure as well is that you can have someone who's a prosecuting attorney in one municipality and be a judge in another one. So one of the municipal court judges in Ferguson is a prosecuting attorney for 3 neighboring municipality, and they get a paycheck for each of these jobs, because they only have to have to be the judge in court
one day a week or something
like
this.
a few days a month. And so he's collecting money, prosecuting people here, then
and being a judge
judging
over
on
here.
cases here. And in the Washington Post story, there was a defense attorney talking about how he had been in a really contested felony case defending someone who's been accused of a felony, and the prosecuting attorney
that he had to go
is really fighting it. And then the next day he has to show up in municipal court to defend someone for traffic violation, and the municipal judge is the same guy that he's been fighting as a prosecuting attorney. And he's like, do I think that my person who had a broken taillight, or I forget what the traffic offense was, do I think they're going to get
an impartial
a fair
judge
shake when we've been going to the mat in this other case? It raises real conflict of interest issues.
It certainly can make people wonder. And I think these are the kinds of things that permeate some of the underlying trust issues that we've seen come up in Ferguson. Also, the things that folks who are watching the news and paying attention do know, that the prosecuting attorney McCullough in the grand jury has his father was killed in a racial issue as a member of a police force. And so you have to ask, is impartiality possible in certain situations? And I believe that, that is a real question. And people, obviously for some time were calling for McCullough to be taken off of the case and a different prosecutor appointed, so that they would have more confidence in the outcome of a grand jury, because the prosecutor can really control a lot of what happens in how and what evidence is presented. And this is closed, so it's a secret. And I remember in the Washington Post article, until more recently, and against law, it was illegal, these court hearings were held closed. So I did read that article also. And so there's a lot of different concerns that anyone, regardless of your race, would have an issue with in some of these structures. And as well. Why was a county building locked when some of the employees were inside and a police force was preventing an elected official, Senator Jamila Nasheed, from presenting thousands of signed signatures to request a different appointment for the prosecuting attorney. And I guess some of that was on the news if folks have been watching it. But so it does raise issues of are we able to trust our justice system when we know from all these different levels we've talked about so far there's this corruption.
I think, too, one of the challenges in any case involving police misconduct or potential police misconduct or a police crime, it's often very difficult to prosecute because of the social networks of prosecuting attorney. I mean, people tend to be more favorable towards people they know and towards their friend and towards people they work with all the time.
Right.
And so what you often have in prosecuting official misconduct or police misconduct is folks are prosecuting their people in their social, I mean, they may
Someone
not be
they know.
close friends, but they're prosecuting people they know, and so that creates
Its own problem instead of
a
problems.
very different dynamic than when you're prosecuting someone who not only does the prosecuting attorney not know, but may feel very socially distant from them in terms
less detached
of
culturally.
in terms of the class background, the cultural background, the you know where they're coming from in terms of that. And so we know in sociology there's a book called The Behavior of Law, which talks a lot about how laws behave, how they behave in practice rather than on paper the law treats everyone equally, but in practice
How can
some people have a lot more
And-
law to rely on than others.
That's true, and then even just the blatant the situations where I was surprised to find that these the Washington Post article revealed that these situations that the smaller court official court hearings were closed to the public against a law, so legal people violating legal law just feels very uncomfortable, I think,
And
for
often,
society. I think it's a very slippery slope for us as a society.
and often poor people who were, in that article they talked about poor people sometimes spending 15 days in jail because, well, they hadn't.
They couldn't afford a prosecutor
Right.
or
and
these.
that people who could afford a lawyer
Or
got to
a
jump
defense attorney,
lines
I mean.
in terms of when they got to pay their tickets and things. So,
Right.
so the municipality, and it's very different between St. Louis and Kansas City. And it's not that Kansas City doesn't have problems, but the structure in St. Louis County really exaggerates and exacerbates all the kinds of problems that
We've been
that
talking.
might happen to some degree in any kind of municipality. But whereas St. Louis has 90 municipalities, Kansas City has 15, and that so there's not like 90 different municipalities trying to raise
Right.
revenue off of fining the poor. And the other big problem that happens with the municipalities in St. Louis is in St. Louis County is if you recall after, kind of in the wake of the Ferguson protests and the police response to those protests, especially police who detained or roughed up or harassed reporters, some greater scrutiny was put on finding out things about those police officers, and a few of them were fired. So, for instance, there was Dan Page, who had pushed the CNN anchor. He had served on the force for 35 years. After he pushes this anchor, people look into his background a little, and he's making a speech to the Oath Keepers where he calls President Obama an illegal immigrant. He rails against Muslims, minorities, and gay people, and then says that, you know, he's killed a lot of people as a police officer, and says, police are very cynical. I know I am. I don't trust anybody. I hate everybody. I'm into diversity. I kill everybody. I don't care. I'm a killer. I've killed a lot, and if I need to, I'll kill a bunch more. And I mean, obviously, when that came out, he was fired, but he was on the force for 35 years. Like,
right.
How did that happen?
And it makes you think, you know, about the buddy system and whatever, and who
Right.
else maybe feels the way he does, and if the way he feels was so blatantly out of step with the rest of the folks,
Right.
probably he would have been gotten rid of a long time ago. So it really does raise huge questions.
And then there was the Lieutenant Albers who pointed a gun at, was captured by a photojournalist pointing a gun at photographers and saying, "I'll kill you," and you know, whether or not it was a serious threat. I mean, he was pointing a gun at someone and
if you
threatening
say that
to
while
kill
you're
them.
holding a loaded gun and a large one, it's
and
pretty threatening for sure.
So there's been a few of these like high-profile cases, and the same with the reporter the police officer who pushed the Huffington Post journalist at the same time that a Washington Post journalist was arrested. Well, there's a civil rights lawsuit against him and a partner for beating up a 12-year-old who was checking their mail and hog-tying him. And what's interesting about a lot of these, like that officer, Justin Cosmo, what's interesting about a lot of these officers is that before they went to the jurisdiction they're in now, they had a history of other police. You know, many of them had histories of excessive force, police brutality in other jurisdictions. But what happens in St. Louis County is what's called muni hopping, which is short for municipality hopping. It basically means if you cause a lot of trouble or you become too much of a burden for a particular police force, you can be fired, more often just encouraged to resign and go elsewhere. And so what you'll have is officers who move from one municipality to another. And in fact, Ferguson is a police force which has several muni hopping officers on it. One of them, Eddie Boyd, actually was originally a St. Louis officer, and he was fired for basically, or forced to he was forced out for serially pistol whipping teens and preteens, or beating and sometimes pistol whipping. At least 2 cases where he pistol whipped a kid, and then several other where beats. And so what does he do? He goes to Ferguson, and then he starts with a clean record there. And even the officer who
Officer Wilson, I believe.
Who killed, who shot Mike Brown, was originally an officer on the Jennings police force, and the entire Jennings police force was
disbanded.
Because of issues of corruption, excessive force, minority harassment, and while we don't know exactly what Officer Wilson's role is in that. We know that
the whole
force had that problem. So when people were talking about him having a clean record, that's counting that he starts over at Ferguson, and also Ferguson up until recently had a policy where officers, as long as the injuries of people were not fatal, they could file their own reports. So a clean record in Ferguson really doesn't mean self-reported clean record. I mean, it doesn't hold a lot of weight there. There was an article about that I'm trying to remember but it was something like the day the Ferguson police were caught in a bloody lie, and it goes through a case where the police office, or the police, and this goes back to the municipality sort of thing, they arrested someone for a warrant for some kind of motor vehicle offense, and they actually arrested someone. It was the wrong person, but they had the same first name and last name. I think it was different middle name. And they detained him in a cell, and he complained about his treatment, and ended up getting beaten up by officers, and then they charged him with a crime for bleeding on their uniforms, and that,
Yes.
so that's...
It's pretty difficult to see how do we fix these problems. And I would like to make it really clear that, there are good officers, and that we really need the good officers,
Right.
and somehow our community needs to help support our good officers, because we do have problems throughout our culture, and certainly then within this conversation of our police culture as well. And how do we make that better? How do we return it to where the public in years past, we used to have a much different dynamic with our police officers. At least I remember growing up in a small town in Oklahoma. We didn't have this much violence from any part of our culture where I grew up, luckily. Maybe, I had a really sheltered area, but I do think that, there wasn't as much violence, there wasn't maybe as much corruption at that time, and it seems to have gotten worse as a culture. And so we do want to, make it very clear that we do support the officers that are trying to do a good job, and some of them have come out and been whistleblowers in their departments, and unfortunately that does seem to be something that is more damaging to the whistleblower, not only in the police but in other cases of whistleblowing as well, in these cultures that are extremely contaminated, different cultures. And so I think we have to, and we will in future programs, we don't have time to unpack all of this, but we do need to go more deeply in how we look at the information and how we process the information that we're getting, and try to look at sometimes our media. We have to think, well, who owns the media? Where are these stories coming from, and why are there so many problems with whistleblowers, just in all areas, but certainly even in the police culture too. So yeah, we do want to make sure that folks watching understand that society at large, and certainly our organization, supports the good police officers and wants to find ways to solve these problems. And in fact, some of our solutions really are about solving these issues at their core and at their root, with more heart-to-heart connections, more understanding of what you made it clear earlier, how we don't cross our social and cultural boundaries much, how we might try to encourage those kinds of things as solutions, learning to make friends on different sides of our cultural boundaries, and seeing that these people are not so different from ourselves once we begin to be more acquainted with them. So these are some things that People's Visioning tries to bring as solutions. And so while this is a really awful problem to talk about, and some of the things that I'm hearing from you I hadn't heard before, so I'm even shocked as I'm listening to them. But so I can only imagine what the viewers think on either side of the coin. Some of them might be frustrated with us, some of them might be shocked, all kinds of things. But the point is that we have to work together to bring the solutions and bring all the facts, and be open to what do the facts really show, and be open to different sources of these kinds of facts and what our real situation is, so that we can create and build a better future. I don't think any of us really like this. I hope that we don't anyway.
And I think one of the keys, as far as like with police force, is really to create structures and cultures that reward the good officers, which are going to be a majority of officers, and to avoid cultures that sort of allow the bad apples to put, I mean, the barrel
Give them
becomes bad
some-
when you allow people to just move from municipality to municipality
And they
and
can
do what
inf-
they want. And
and they
also,
Can infect
when,
another culture that way.
if you go back to the officer who got fired for, he'd been on the force for 35 years, and he said, I like to
pretty
keep,
blatant.
I'm for killing people. What you sense there is that I doubt he always felt that way, but he worked for surely he had problems all along, but I think they got worse over time because he worked for a force that's
That
very
allowed it.
segregated from
Oh, I see.
the community that it polices, and probably doesn't have much diversity in his social networks. And I think it's really important. I think that you'll find that when people interact with a broader range of people on a daily basis, and it's part of their daily interactions, and I don't mean just like kind of interacting at like a public forum or in sort of piecemeal kind of token sort of ways. That's probably not, even that I think is helpful, but when people have meaningful interactions with diverse social networks, I think there's much.
I think that's a good way to improve our problem.
Right.
And I think I'll just kind of wind that up and move into something else by reminding us, though, that about this article that I read in the Rural Cooperative about our state history. And, some of these things do run really deep, and it would be so wonderful if we could, start to use what you're just saying, at these really deeper levels to, ask ourselves what are our moral, standings for being able to hold certain viewpoints, and could there be ways that we might want to reach out to others? I'll quickly give an example of something that one of our co-sponsors, Columbia Climate Change Coalition, helped to start, and that was the Interfaith Care for Creation folks. And they have a garden project where they come from different faith backgrounds, and this sort of takes us out of the race and into, our dynamics of faith. It's the same kind of thing. We butt heads somewhat similarly in that area. So we had this project for many reasons, and one of the social cultural aspects of it was that when these people from different faiths would work side by side in this garden, which fed the hungry and the poor, so there was, a lot of different moral reasons for doing this, but it had kind of the side benefit of people getting to know one another that normally wouldn't, and therefore then having a chance to follow their moral teachings and apply them to these situations. So maybe these kinds of things could, and these sorts of projects designed in ways to help us resolve some of where our root issues go that deep back to. And so I'd like to mention that kind of takes me into something recently. The United Nations just recently, I guess the headline said, slammed the U.S. For lack of progress in addressing racism and these issues we're talking about. There's a committee to end racial discrimination, CERD, Committee to End Racial Discrimination, out of the UN. And this committee listed a whole number of things, and again, you can Google search this as well. It's a very interesting article, not about half as long as the Washington Post article, but both articles very valuable and informative. This was this committee's very thorough, I thought, taking to task essentially of the United States for not living up to our agreement. We've ratified a UN agreement to work on these things, and therefore it is a law for us. Again, we're not really obeying our own laws that we've agreed to. Kind of these sort of recurring themes now in this conversation, a little bit here and there at least, and certainly in this issue anyway, again, racism and this discrimination. So a couple of areas that jumped out in that report that the committee brought out were, I'll just mention the whole overview list: economic opportunities, related to that heavily is education and schooling. Related to how how our whole society works at large would be voting, and of course some of our dynamics, if these police folks are appointed or hired, then someone elected generally does the appointing, et cetera. So voting, and how does that impact these issues we're talking about? Also issues of environmental racism, which kind of takes us to something we'll close with in a minute here, but before we talk a lot about that, but that is something I'll mention largely though with energy, but other really industrial uses that have a lot of industrial toxins and chemicals, et cetera, that aren't always related to energy, but to our modern lifestyle, so environmental racism. And then another main category was the treatment of women, certainly Native and African American women, but all ethnic women in terms of this discrimination, certainly racial discrimination, but also just violence at large against women domestically, but also in the culture, rape and sexual violence. So all of these things kind of go back into our laws, how the laws are written, who writes the laws, who do they serve, you know, the language can be interpreted in different ways and by whom, again, back to our elected officials. And it noted in this UN call out of us needing to do a much better job in this area. It noted how we actually had backslid, unfortunately, in a couple of areas through our current U.S. Supreme Court. Again, voting, again, elected, appointed, agreed on or ratified positions by our elected officials. So a lot of our court systems have that dynamic going on through the different positions of the different parties, you know, and what interests do these party platforms serve. So areas that we seem to have actually gone backwards in would be our schools and our voting law, our laws that surround the education and voting. So we can't go into all that at this time, but I would urge folks to Google search that article about the United Nations and this Committee to End Racial Discrimination, CERD, and their recent paper that calls out the United States to do a better job in that area. So I would like to ask if you would want to comment on any of that before we kind of move to another topic, though.
I think you covered the important things.
Pieces there.
I suppose we could say a little about what environmental racism is, in the sense that what it often refers to is like disproportionately toxic chemicals, hazardous materials end up being placed in minority neighborhoods. There's actually, several years ago, there was an interesting study that commissioned, I think it was by the United Church of Christ, and they had like a sociologist like quantify and figure out, you know, how bad the problem was, and it's pretty serious. I mean,
yes.
It's not.
It's almost entirely handled that way.
Right. Yeah.
It's like the not in my backyard, and who are the folks that
Right,
kind of control the power structures, and it begins to be more clear. And you know, some of us will just have to kind of look at our value structure, I guess, and ask some of the moral questions, you know, that I hope that the folks who have different religious backgrounds will look to their faith to say, you know, who is this right? You know, is this right to treat my neighbor in this way? And aren't all human beings supposed to be created equal? Our governing language says so, but you know, how do we practice these? And doesn't if we do follow faith tradition, because not everyone does, but if we do our faith traditions pretty much uphold that? And if we're all created equal, then maybe we would have some different input, to our own hearts first of all, because we can't change anything unless we look at our own selves. So, again, this garden project that I mentioned and other ways that we can reach out to really, become more caring about our neighbors, because I do believe all of our faith traditions ask us to do that. They ask us to help the poor and the hungry, but we often don't see that, and we often taking place or reflecting, in if folks of faith are guided by this, and folks that are not of faith, they also know right from wrong and have some type of moral structure that they operate on. So from whatever background we come, we would ask these kinds of questions, what is right and moral in these ways. And so these environmental dumps are almost entirely because of the structure that we've created that does seem to have a discriminatory pattern. You would have to acknowledge that that's pretty much a fact after you do some research. So it impacts these people, and they're the least able to afford health care, and it pretty much is, to many of them, essentially a death sentence in many cases, because the toxins are found to cause the cancers and all asthma, all different kinds of health problems, black lung disease. So we have to rethink, how do we get our energy? We did talk in the past about all the pesticides and the antibiotics and those kind of environmental damaging forms when it comes to the food picture, but other forms of industry as well. So we are having a rally on September 22nd here locally, and folks in the area might be able to join us. And if you're watching from the broader viewing area, you could look online for rallies in your area that would be closer to you, that would be in support of folks from around the world calling for greater action on climate change. Based on this pollution issue, we in People's Visioning have tried to help us bridge a divide in an argument about who causes climate change, and just simply say that the way we're doing energy right now, whether people believe it does or doesn't contribute to climate change, we certainly can see that it contributes a lot to a pollution issue that is ever growing. And if we continue down that path, we can see that at some point, we reach beyond the point of no return just with the level of pollution. It's an unsustainable model when you just look at it even from the point of pollution causing so much health. Asthma is the largest missed health day for our schools. And what cost is that to society, from jobs to, if people don't have jobs, then, a lawless society, or to what cost is it in terms of health, so these are things that we need to all look at the bigger picture. But if we can just get on the same page and say, hey, if we just clean up the pollution, that's what the folks who think humans are contributing would want, so we don't have to be butting heads anymore. And we can all just say, hey, yes, let's, start doing this. And that's from the prevention side of it. But from the adaptation side of it, it's pretty clear we need to all be on the same page more easily, possibly, to say we need to put some things in place that will be smart, longer-term solutions to when we get these heavy downpours and it starts flooding everywhere. So what are we going to do? So we need to start working on the adaptation, and of course the folks that are, the environmental racism category, the low-income people and people of different race. Those folks, the low-income white people, are going to have the least with which to adapt financially. And the greatest burden seems to be on them because they are in the less high ground areas. So I want to mention that our rally here is on September 22nd out in front of City Hall in Columbia, Missouri, 8th and Broadway. You're welcome to join us. It's 5 to 6 p.m. Spread the word and find a rally in your area, and hopefully that's a way that we can start building these bridges among each other in areas that we might normally argue. I want to say we might not have time to take up fully some other changes that we do need to look at, and that's in 2006, the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security, and the National Defense Authorization Act in 2010 that has made demonstrating actually, it has changed how we used to have the freedom of speech and the freedom to assemble, and has made that a more blurry line and illegal. So we would like to take some of those up in future conversations, and we hope that you could join us
also
again.
the militarization of
Yes.
suburban police forces, well,
Yes.
police
Which
forces
fits-
in general.
Yes, which
Yeah.
fits into this. So
Yes.
we need to look at that more in depth, maybe some financial things about our military and why do we even fight wars in general across the globe. Maybe that has something to do with our energy or other resources, our lifestyles. We have to kind of look at these things. So we'd like to invite you to come back and join us another time, but also to talk about this big chunk that we didn't have time to get to today. But I would like to ask you if you would want to have any closing remarks beyond that.
Well, I guess, I mean, the only thing I would say about the militarization of police forces is that when Homeland Security money was doled out, I mean, I think the idea was that it's Homeland Security money, but it was spread out across the country, and a lot of places didn't see themselves as high.
Weren't high risk
Right,
for
and
Homeland
so
Security.
it was spread out fairly evenly. So whereas New York and Washington D.C., maybe even Los Angeles are maybe
Might be more
Chicago are
prone.
primary targets. What it meant for a lot of small police districts is like high-tech war on drugs sort of equipment or high-tech military equipment, you know, fun toys to play with that,
Right.
you know,
And we do want to try out the toys, don't we? So,
and so they get tried out,
sometimes we get to try them out.
They're more likely probably to be tried out on populations seen as, quote, dangerous than
Or
those that are
other,
not.
or different than, which is how we kind of
Right.
seem to,
Yeah.
you know, so from the sociological perspective, that might be a good note to close on, that we've kind of been trying to bring as some solutions out of people's visioning. How can we start seeing ourselves as a more, you know, united community and find the root solutions to these problems so we can really live in a better peace and harmony and go back to some different days that weren't quite like what we're seeing today. This isn't the kind of road I think any of us really want to see continuing or escalating. So thank you for being with us today, and we hope that you've been enjoying the People's Visioning programming. We hope to keep you informed on these things, and want to welcome you to find us on Facebook. We'd like to acknowledge our other co-sponsors. We've mentioned two of them so far: Columbia Climate Change Coalition, Democracy for Missouri. Wayne is the president of Democracy for Missouri. Sweet Ethics Sustainability, KOPN Public Radio here out of Columbia. Food Not Bombs, Native American Support Group, Boone County Smart Growth Coalition, MORE, which is based out of St. Louis, and they are Missourians organizing for reform and empowerment. Mid-Missouri Move to Amend, and it's both out of Jefferson's, well, it's mid-Missouri, several communities here, and also our People's Visioning Mizzou. So we want to thank you, and we urge you to find us on Facebook for some of our events and to learn more about us, and we'd be glad to help you start a People's Visioning in your community. Thanks for joining in.